Our next speakers who spoke yesterday, or speaking again today, on a different topic, Margo Wilson and Marty Daly, their topic will be on violence against stepchildren, the evidence and its discontents. McMaster University in Canada.
Hello, thanks. This topic, violence against stepchildren, was the first thing that Margo and I worked on when we became interested in studying Homo sapiens, as opposed to the other animals that we had been studying for years before that. And the question about violence against stepchildren arose from the question about whether stepchildren are at excess risk of violence arose from our background in non-human animal behavior and from comparative considerations. The basic idea that motivates asking this question is the idea that one might reasonably expect, parental solicitude to be discriminative. After all, parental investment in the well-being of young is costly. It's an allocation of valuable time and energy. There are lost opportunities when one chooses to invest one's resources in a particular kid. And if parental motives have evolved by natural selection, they'd be expected to exhibit some sort of design for allocating parental resources effectively. So what sort of discriminations might we expect evolved parental psyches to make, if indeed they evolve? Fairly obvious couple are that you might expect there to be some sort of discrimination on the basis of phenotypic quality. How able is this offspring to convert parental investment into gains in its own parental fitness? So, for example, you might stop incubating an egg that you detect is cracked, although animals do sometimes seem to be quite cautious in coming to the conclusion that an offspring is of insufficient phenotypic quality to continue investing. And there's the issue of need as well. Even a very healthy and robust offspring, you might terminate investment in them if they don't need parental investment in order to thrive. But a third possible issue for some animals is whether a particular offspring is really the parent's own. And obviously we might expect parental inclinations to be modulated by cues of parental probability. So when will we expect that mechanisms for recognizing your own offspring and favoring them over alien young would have evolved? Whoops, wrong direction, sorry. Its answer is when there's a natural risk of errors. When in the species' ancestral environment, the environment of evolutionary adaptedness, if you like that phrase, parents have been exposed to situations in which they might have been, which they were at risk of misdirecting parental investment to the benefit of rivals' fitness. And this principle is best illustrated comparatively, and I'll give just a single comparative example in the interest of time. Famous old study by Tim Burkhead decades ago, comparing these two species of alcib birds who are ecologically quite similar but who nest in slightly different circumstances and exhibit different parental adaptations for that reason. Guillemots, or we call them murres in North America, guillemots in England, nest in aggregations illustrated by this picture. Pairs are separated by just a few centimeters, whereas razorbills nest dispersedly on rocky cliffs, the pairs separated by meters. Guillemot eggs can be displaced into a neighbor's nest. Razorbill eggs cannot be so displaced, except, of course, if the likes of Tim Burkhead come along and swap them artificially, not a natural selective force. And arguably for that reason, guillemots learn to recognize their eggs, they hatch them more or less immediately after they're laid, and reject a fostered egg. When their chick hatches, they inspect their chick and hence thereafter reject a fostered chick, as chicks can move between nests. This is not a naturally recurring risk for razorbills, and so they're oblivious. They don't learn to identify their own egg, they don't learn to identify their own chick, and they'll gladly accept an experimental fostering, presumably because this was not an adaptive problem that their ancestors confronted. The implication is that natural selection equips animals with psyches that direct parental investment preferentially to the parent's own young. And this raises the interesting question why anybody ever plays step-parent and invests in young that they have good cues, good evidence, is not their own. Well, step-parenting is not unique to Homo sapiens. In some species of animals, and ones that certainly were in the forefront of our minds at the time we first became interested in this question, those who acquire a new mate with dependent young typically kill those young and speed up the process of breeding with their new partner. And I illustrate this with a picture of barn swallows in which both sexes do this. Males who supplant a predecessor will kill their predecessor's young and nest sooner as a result. Females who supplant another female will do likewise. But in other species, step-parents ignore or even help raise the kids. And I illustrate this with a picture of a peregrine falcon, which have been reported to behave in this way. And again, both sexes have been reported to behave in this way. Homo sapiens is obviously a step-parenting species. I think Sievert Rower, a number of years ago, the ornithologist Sievert Rower, gave the best account of this variability by showing in a review arguably not the most systematic or quantifiable analysis, but I think quite convincing comparative review, that helping raise step offspring can be understood as mating effort, that it tends to occur in those species in which when you form these new partnerships, they're likely to endure for some considerable period of time, that they happen where the couple is likely to reproduce again together, and where good breeding opportunities, I should say, are scarce. And so playing step-parent is, in effect, the cost that a single individual is willing to pay in order to acquire a desirable mate. I want to mate with you in the long term so much, I'm even willing to raise your kid from a previous union. And arguably, the same argument might apply to why step-parenting investment seems to be widespread, probably universal in the human species. But in a step-parenting species, I think there's grounds to still expect that parental solicitude would be discriminative, with own young preferred. That is to say, the stepchild is seldom or never so valuable to the step-parent's fitness as an own child would be. And so even though you're willing to play investor, are you willing to put your life on the line for this kid? Are you as selflessly invested in the stepchild as in the genetic child? Arguably not, even in successful step relationships. We have no evidence on this question that I'm aware of. Maybe some has been published in the last couple of years. In any non-human animal, the question of whether in a step-parenting species, step-parents nevertheless exhibit some reticence in step investment as compared to genetic parent investment. As far as I'm aware, we don't have any evidence on this one way or the other, a good study of this question in any non-human animal. But we certainly have some evidence bearing on this question in people. Margo?
So we all know the story of Cinderella. It's a ubiquitous story. You can find it around the world. Different names and details vary a little bit, but it seems to be a universal story for children. And here the ugly stepsisters are looking malevolently upon Cinderella, but the stories often are of the stepmother, and maybe more commonly across cultural of the stepfather. And so we were aware of this story. As Martin said, we were aware of comparative literature. Sarah had recently demonstrated the risk to female langurs, infants, when a new male came on the scene. And so these sort of questions about, if you like, the Cinderella story came to mind. And we thought, given that we weren't experts in the social sciences, except for a little bit of psychology, that we would just look up the literature on child abuse, and we would find whether step-parents are indeed more likely to maltreat their children or not. And but there was nothing that we could find, nothing at all, so we had to do it ourselves. This was a long time ago. So we got data from the American Humane Association and estimated the relative risk to children of being physically maltreated, as depicted in this slide. It's a function of whether they live with two genetic parents and a step parent. This figure is based on 27,000 cases of validated physical child abuse, and so this was interesting. We worried about this. We thought the effect was obvious, especially for the youngest children, and there's all kinds of issues that I'm going to address right now. One issue is we haven't identified the perpetrator here. It's just the household circumstance. Maybe it's the mother that's abusing the child when in a stepfather household. Maybe it's the reverse. And so the reason we didn't identify the perpetrator in these kinds of households is we were advised by people who validated these kinds of data and social workers that the information would be unreliable in terms of who a perpetrator was, because the mother often took the blame if indeed it was perpetrated by her new husband. And so later we had the opportunity in Canada to look at homicides. Homicides are taken very seriously everywhere, and the cases are investigated. And I think the identification of perpetrator is far more reliable than it would be in the case of non-lethal abuse. So we did think that there is a possibility of the bias detection because of the prevalence of the Cinderella story when there was equivocal evidence about the nature of the maltreatment. And so what we did was we looked at Canadian homicide data for this period, and it's obvious. We don't even have to do any statistics here. There are indeed more cases of genetic parents killing their infant than there are in step-parent cases, of course, but the relative risk is hugely different for young children, especially the very young children. Adolescents, of course, can just leave when things get rough, but the very young ones are far more vulnerable. And so I think this identified the step-parent role per se, but we might be focused on the wrong sort of issue that is behind the risk to children. It could be confounds associated with step-parenthood, and one of these might be, for example, poverty. Maybe step-parent families are poorer, and it's a known risk factor that poverty elevates the risk of maltreatment. And but in Canada and the U.S., the distribution of household incomes is exactly the same kind of distribution for two genetic families and step-parent families. Single-parent families, of course, it's very different. And but that wasn't the comparison we had been making. And so it brought to our attention, people asked us later, well, okay, it's just boyfriends, it's not really husbands that are doing this, and they're sort of in the role of stepfather, but they're not, they don't show the same kind of commitment to the woman and her children as a man would be who was willing to do a registered marriage. So we thought this was an interesting issue, and Canadian data allowed us to make this assessment. And it wasn't a risk factor, but it's common law versus registered is a risk factor, but it doesn't account for the step-parent effect. So you can see on the bottom here, I hope, that stepfathers in common law unions, the rate of the men killing the young children is way higher than the putative genetic fathers. And that's also, the difference is also very large in registered unions. And so it's evident that both the step-parent role and the type of marital union are both risk factors, but one does not remove the other. And so the other kind of question was maybe the kind of men that become stepfathers, women that become stepmothers have kind of aggressive personalities, and that's why children are vulnerable. There's a few very small sample studies of where there's both the child of the union and a stepchild, and you can ask the question which child is targeted. And so we are we were aware of 3 studies, one in Pennsylvania. They're all cases where there was this kind of opportunity, if you like, to maltreat your own child or a stepchild, and it was always a stepchild. 9 out of 10 such cases in our home city of Hamilton. In a nearby city of Brantford, it's also predominantly the stepchild that is targeted. And so that sort of removes the issue of personality aspects. I'm not to say that they're not relevant, but at least the abuse was selective. And so we worried about for a woman to remarry who already has a child. She presumably had the child younger in many cases than if it was a first union and it was the child of the union. So we worried about that. What didn't seem to be a risk factor. Number of children in the home is identified as a risk factor by the social workers and other people studying child abuse, and that didn't seem to affect the step-parent effect that we had seen. The most telling data that we have on the step, that focusing on the stepfather versus the genetic father, is that sort of the qualitative differences in the homicides. So we think this speaks to the question of the mindset of the men, in terms that it also suggests the mindset of their sort of commitment and parental psychology, and why there's a risk of abuse. So in Canada and in England, we have a comparison here of cases where the child was killed by a genetic father or a stepfather, and we've limited it to small children because to avoid the issue of a battle that an older child might be able to engage in, and we've looked only at the cases where here we're showing you where the child was beaten to death. It was an assault. The language that the police used slightly different in the 2 countries, but I think you'd probably agree that both bespeak an assault. And the percent of cases perpetrated by stepfathers that assaulted the child to death were much higher in both countries. The other thing that bespeaks the mindset is that it's not uncommon for a man who kills his own child to commit suicide in the same context. He also might kill his wife. It's a family project, if you like, so suicide bespeaks a very different mindset than the absence of suicide. So these genetic fathers are in depressive, presumably. They've killed the child not by assaulting typically, but that's not the characteristic of the stepfathers. They very few cases of committing suicide afterwards, and they don't no evidence that I know of that they seem to be depressive. More likely they're just angry, and so we think that these kind of data speak to the sort of differences in the parental psyche of the 2 kinds of men. We also were interested in the issue of the risk to wives as a function of whether there was a stepchild in the household, because you can imagine if a man is assaulting the child or abusing it in some way and mistreating it, that the woman would not be happy about this. This can create a huge amount of marital conflict, and is she at risk? And so, it's sort of interesting. At the time we were doing this kind of thing, there was huge literature, as there is still today, on violence against wives, and people have been trying to identify risk markers. And here's this article made a list of almost 100 kinds of risk markers, but they never mentioned the issue of paternity of the children, and still we don't know about the alleged paternity for putative genetic fathers. Anyway, so we were studying violence against wives at the same time, and so we looked to see if women with stepchildren were more vulnerable. And here's 2 studies that we did in our city of Hamilton. So first opportunity we had was to do a study at a shelter and look at the women who were admitted to the shelter for protection, and in these shelters in Hamilton, of course, the women can bring their children, and And so we looked at whether the child's what she brought with her, or the children she brought with her, were her own by this man, or were they a stepchild to this man who was assaulting her. And so we thought it would absolutely be clear between genetic and step, but even the mixed was an elevated admission rate to these shelters. The Exuricide data for Hamilton, there's a small number of cases, but it's very clear that the women who were killed were much more likely to be killed if their child was a stepchild to the man who killed them. And this result has been replicated elsewhere, including in Texas. So this is step parenthood is a tricky situation for family dynamics.
Want to stress, in showing these dramatic differences in risk, that homicides by step-parents are rare. Sexually selected infanticide, as you might see in a barn swallow or a langur monkey, it seems clear to us, some people have suggested otherwise, it seems clear to us that this is not a human adaptation. Not only is it rare, but it's ineffectually carried out. Step-parents are far more likely to non-lethally abuse children in ways that actually raise their investment costs than they are to dispose of them cleanly, like a lion getting rid of his predecessor's kids. We don't think it makes any sense to try and say that homicides by stepfathers represent sexually selected infanticide. But you can understand differential risk to children, we think, as a non-adaptive byproduct of something that is an adaptation, that is discriminative parental affection. Assaulting children may not be adaptive, but it is predictable from an adaptationist perspective that when children are assaulted, stepchildren might be excessively at risk. Now, if that's right, and homicide is like an extreme assay of discriminative parental solicitude, an extreme reverse assay, the extreme assay of discriminative parental insolicitude, then what about less extreme responses, and what about positive investments? Step-parental investment is cross-culturally, I think, universal, and in Homo sapiens as another step-parenting species, it's readily understood as mating effort, I've argued, but still we might expect it to be restrained. Now, there is now a lot of evidence that that's the case. What you might call mundane, nonviolent, everyday discrimination against stepchildren. Some of the nicest work on this has been done by Ann Case and her collaborators, economists at Princeton. And in one study by Ann and Chris Paxton, they showed that controlling for household size and income and various other things in one of these clever econometric analyses, they found that children living with stepmothers are significantly less likely to have routine doctor and dental visits than children living with their genetic mothers, controlling for family means and a bunch of other things. They've also found in other studies that U.S. stepmother families spend less money per child on food than do genetic mother families, these being domains in which presumably mothers have principal control over the investment decisions. And you see these effects in stepmother households, but not in stepfather households. Case and other people have found that where stepfathers matter are in things like this, providing money for college education. The proportion of, even if children go to college, which stepchildren are less likely to do than children living with their genetic parents, they're less likely to have any support, any financial support from the parents, controlling for parental means. And there are other studies. Mark, many years ago, showed that Trinidadian men simply spent less time with their stepchildren than with the genetic children. K.G. Anderson has shown that Xhosa men in South Africa help their children with their homework less than with co-resident genetic children. Frank Marlowe, in some limited but interesting data, shows that men who are playing stepfather and in no way abusive towards the children, and in some sense investing in them, nevertheless never initiate play with them, whereas genetic fathers do. Various signs that stepfatherhood, step-parenthood is not fully engaging the psychology of parental inclination on average or often. And of course, Mark Flinn has also demonstrated something that is not itself a demonstration of mundane or nonviolent discrimination against stepchildren, but might be interpreted as a product thereof, and that is that there's some evidence of chronic cortisol elevation in Dominican stepchildren as compared to those children living with their genetic parents in the same village in very similar material circumstances. So, question is this a very general human pattern? And there are large differences in child homicide rates by step versus genetic parents. We can say with confidence in Australia, Canada, Great Britain, and the US. There are studies showing large differences in non-lethal abuse in all of those countries as well as in several others. There's stepchild versus genetic child differences in child mortality in historical studies like those of Eckert Voland in historical archives from Germany and in modern data archives and among Ache hunter-gatherers in Paraguay. But there have been some counterclaims, and I want to say a word or two about them. That was the discontents in our title. Paper by Richard Gelles and collaborator a number of years ago on the basis of a U.S. telephone survey, respondents were asked this question if they had slapped, punched, used a knife or gun on children in the home. They're phoned and they're asked this question. And 117 step-parents participated, and they were no more likely to say yes to these questions than genetic parents. Fine. Gelles and Harrop write, this is the first test of a Cinderella effect that has met the normal standards of social scientific evidence. That's a very sad comment, if true. All prior evidence is biased because it relies on official reports. There's a couple of interesting points about that. One is that prior evidence does not rely on official reports. Victimization surveys, which do not rely on official reports at all, show the same kind of difference. But it's interesting how much some people seem to want to hear this message, that the whole thing is an artifact and it's not true because we've done it in a controlled way and it disappears. The American Medical Association put out a massive guidelines for child welfare workers about risks for abuse of children in the 1990s, in which their only mention, and this is like a 170-page document, in which the only mention of step relationships was a citation of Gelles and Harrop to the effect that it has been suggested by some that there is excess risk to stepchildren, but it has been shown in a representative survey that it's not really true. This is disappointing. There's an analysis by a group in Sweden of homicides in which they found no excess risk to stepchildren. And again, they portrayed this as reason to believe that the whole thing must have been an artifact or not true anywhere. They simply did their analysis badly. They forgot that the prevalence of step-parenthood changes with age. And so the victims are very young, but the average age of the probability of having a stepchild they were assessing was for all children up to age 15. And so the denominator is like, 10% of kids have a step-parent and 10% of victims live in a step-parent household, but the victims are all under 2, and almost none of those have step-parents. When the data are analyzed correctly, they do show a highly significant difference, but interestingly, a much smaller one than we found elsewhere. And this sort of question about why there's cross-national variability in the magnitude of the excess risk actually deserves a lot of attention that it's not been getting, due to a sort of weird distraction about whether these phenomena are real at all. Finally, we have a funny study in which the researchers did a bunch of cross-tabulations within a sample of U.S. abuse cases and came to this conclusion. And if you're having trouble parsing it, that's biological parents were more rather than less likely than non-biological parents to abuse severely and to kill rather than, the double rather than structure. If you're having trouble parsing it, that's because you can't really. It speaks to numbers within a cross-tabulation of abuse cases. They included no population at large data nor rate estimates. And in fact, step-parents were vastly overrepresented in all types of abuse, severe and non-severe and lethal. And nevertheless, this study is cited repeatedly as evidence that the Cinderella effect isn't real. And my favorite example is this that appeared in the American Psychologist 10 years ago, in which they cited this paper as having disproven what they called the neoconservative contention that stepfathers abuse children more frequently than biological fathers. It seems clear that dislike of this phenomenon is somehow linked to some notion that it's being advanced with a political agenda, and of course a reactionary one. Finally, the philosopher David Buller, with whom some of you may be acquainted, and who's got a lot of approving citations in a recent book, has spent a whole chapter on this topic. He asserts all the evidence cited in support of Cinderella effects can be explained away as products of bias detection. We just discover those cases more. I remind you of these phenomena Margo showed you. If you just look at fatal batterings of Canadian preschoolers over a 17-year period, for this difference to be an artifact of bias detection, we have an average of 4 cases of fatal batterings by genetic fathers a year. There'd have to be over 500 undetected ones every year for this to be an artifact of bias detection, if we assumed that all the stepfather cases are being discovered, but there's limited detection of the genetic father cases. There aren't even enough childhood deaths for this to be so. And again, there's victimization surveys, which tell very much the same story. What we want to say in conclusion is that the point is not to stigmatize step-parents or to say step relationships are a disaster, but that parental love is special. It's really quite remarkable. Parents don't off their kids more often, as somebody else commented the other day. You need a certain amount of inhibition of anger to deal with some of the more annoying aspects of these little parasites. Parental investment entails some sort of long-term cumulative one-way flow of resources that's uniquely ungrudged among human relationships. And the predominant notion of parenthood as well as step-parenthood in the social science literature has been that it is, open quotes, a role, close quotes. I think it's a very bad metaphor, and sometimes it's elevated to the status of a theory, role theory. It makes it sound like all you got to do is learn the script and you can be an effective parent. It just leaves aside, it denies the profundity of parental love by leaving aside all the emotional and motivational issues involved in effective parenting. And our suggestion is not that step-parents are evil, but that parents are remarkably indulgent towards children, and in the absence of that evolved indulgence, risks rise. Thank you.
We have some time for a few questions.
So this question may not be a surprise. What do you see as the implications for preventing child abuse?
It's a great question. I think, raising the barriers to marriage dissolution and marriage reformation would be a very bad answer. But, to some extent, the message we would derive from this converges on conclusion that's been drawn by many child welfare workers in the trench without a Darwinian thought in their mind, and that is what's sometimes called getting over the myth of instant love, or that you can reconstitute a family with step-family and have people love each other. I think it would help a lot if all parties in step relationships recognize step parental investment as generous, and as something to be appreciative of. Because in a lot of cases of conflictual step families, you have the circumstance where the genetic parent is trying to manipulate the step. They're always saying, your daughter, so-and-so, is not my body daughter, is the response to it or whatever, and you have this sort of, you have to or you're expected to make these investments because now you're the father, and if this sort of thing is resented. I mean, the idea that the step, that everybody accepts that the step relationship is not going to become psychologically like a genetic relationship, but ideally it will become an affectionate and reciprocal relationship is one thing. Then, I think we need to investigate what's different in places where the excess risk is much lower. I think the excess risk really is much lower in Sweden. And if that's so, there may be something about the Swedish welfare state that leads genetic parents to be perhaps less obliged to the rearing of their children and therefore less resentful of the obligations, for example. I don't know. But I think those kind of things want investigation.
Do the data, what about adoptive parents? Where do they fall in your data?
Is someone going to talk? Sarah's going to talk about that. Okay.
Most of your data was about, or in fact, all of it was about stepfathers. Is there enough data to do the same sort of thing when the genetic parent is a father and the step parent is a mother?
For the homicides, there are not enough data. There are a trickle of cases, but there's so few. However, very, very few children live with, very young children live with stepmothers. The victimization survey data, in which you're more often asking people whether they were mistreated, when you ask people about whether, when you ask adolescents about how they're treated at home or whether they're assaulted or abused and so on, they suggest that excess risk from stepmothers versus genetic mothers is on the same order as excess risk from stepfathers versus genetic fathers. But can't say that with certainly can't say it with confidence about the homicide risk.
Infanticide for other reasons is quite common and could quite plausibly be an adaptation. So why not in the step-parent case?
Well, Ed said infanticide in other contexts can be common in the human animal as in others and is arguably the result of adaptation at least neonatal or neonatal abandonment in circumstances where one cannot raise a child is arguably reflects an adaptation specifically for that purpose. So why not step-parental infanticide? I mean, I would fall back on the argument, first of all, that it doesn't seem to be routinized under any circumstance anywhere.
But I'm just wondering why not?
You mean why would it not be?
Yeah.
What's funny about people compared to some other primates who do have sexually selected infanticide?
Right.
Surely the answer must have something to do with our complex sociality. I mean, if you go offing your predecessor's kid, you make enemies who can get even with you. Your mate is not isolated from, not always, not often, totally isolated from a kin group that also cared about the welfare of that child. And of course, in the modern world, of course, you could, well, maybe even in non-modern world, you can encounter certain kinds of, third-party trouble for this. I know, like David Buss is enthusiastic about the idea that there are various homicidal modules between our ears, one of which is offing stepchildren facultatively in the right circumstances. I think it's a weak argument because it requires that this has actually promoted fitness more effectively than simply disinvestment with enough statistical reliability in human ancestry to have actually fashioned some complex facultative adaptation. And I just don't see in the anthropological record or anywhere else any evidence that this is prevalent enough, or those circumstances are prevalent enough to have fashioned such an adaptation. Thank you.
Don't jinx me. Yeah, hopefully our computer gremlins have been exercised. I did discover a second adapter cable, if that was the problem. Somehow I'm going to surely be able to use this to justify getting a new grant and to get another computer. I still have my original Apple portable computer that I took to the field in 1992, I think, and it still works. Okay, domestic trauma. Hopefully not my domestic trauma. What I'm going to talk about is some of the hormonal things that we've been able to see associated with different family relationships and the importance of that for child well-being. Be starting with the primary question of stress and why it's adaptive. In particular, why there are links between our psychological, neurological mechanisms for perceiving stressors and the physiological mechanisms involved with stress response.
This is Mark Flinn.
So I got to thinking about what the domestic risk factors for stress were in this population, and then I saw a beautiful poster by John Zeiker and some other data today that really answered that question, I think, very nicely. And the answer for my study population and Dominica is much the same. If a female has got powerful male kin, and that just really helps her out. She's much more likely to get in a good mating relationship to begin with, and it's likely to be more stable. The second issue is whether or not she has stepchildren, and that's something I'm going to deal with in this talk. So the other questions will be, why psychosocial stress? Why are we sensitive to our social environments? And why are children sensitive to stress in their environments? And then how does this play out in terms of outcomes? Uh-oh. Okay, I give up. My computer is clearly jinxed. So, apple number 2. Yeah. That's all right. You know, I've been habituated to this now, so almost predictable. But it's not the cable. It's just, I don't think I want to leave Salt Lake City, you know. It's great. Oh. Yeah. We've got some more testosterone dampening, oxytocin raising. It's not on.
Waiting for computer number 2. I wanted to mention many of us had a lot of trouble going around last night and seeing all of the posters that we wanted to see. And it was suggested that we put them up on the web.
Oh, this is the wrong adapter.
So I don't know when or where exactly, but go to the same website that you went to get information of this conference, and we will make a link clear so that we have an opportunity to look at those things also.
I think I can just run it off my hard drive, or should I download it? It'll go through fast enough? Okay.
Like the previous pattern forums, the whole thing is being videotaped, and those are also going to be on the web. Not just PowerPoints, but the video also.
This is not going to be a good Mac commercial if it's online.
Is this magnetic?
Yes.
Yeah.
Are you playing audio?
No.
If you were,
Yeah, then it'd be a problem.
it would. Hey, thanks for your patience.
I'm curious. I mean, I've never run into this power with my problem with my computer before, so who knows what it is. Curious that has that time thing too, where it's working great and now I don't know if it's heat related.
I don't know. If it was, that's what we're projecting, so I don't know anything about it.
Yeah. Don't know. Thank you for your patience. Maybe damp the lights a bit. Well, on we go here. We have our questions. It's not going to format perfectly, but we can live. So we're going to be looking at kids and seeing what kind of family environments influence their stress response primarily. And I'm addressing this question starting with Nico Tinbergen's 4 types of explanation. If we start out with a trait like, say, parental love or grandparental love, there are different things we'd like to understand about that trait, the proximate mechanisms, and that's something I'm especially interested in, looking at the hormonal correlates that underpin these relationships. We're interested in the phylogeny, evolutionary history, comparison, our close relatives to look at similarities and differences. We're interested in the ontogeny, the development of the trait, how that works, and then the adaptive function, how it evolved, why natural selection favored the trait that we're interested in. And we're going to be looking at hormones, which are such wonderful things. And developmentally thinking in particular here, we have such physically altricial infants, but they have this remarkable mental precociality. They develop these fiber optic cables to program their brains. They're just informational sponges. And they take a long time doing it. We have an extended childhood, an extended post-reproductive period, including menopause, which can be argued to be important in terms of the kind of alloparental care that the human child is receiving. And, yeah. We think that having caretakers around is important for our offspring. I've shown you a picture of Aisha before, and she is a remarkably bright little girl. And she does have a very big brain, which is very costly, and developmentally really expensive to program. And it evolved in just a snap of the fingers evolutionarily, 2 million years, less than 2 million years. And she, like most of us, has got these remarkable social competencies. And we don't think that we can explain it with being able to be more effective at hunting down the wily mango. Now, Aisha, when she's exposed to an acute stressor, she responds, like Calvin here, by releasing cortisol. It's a key stress hormone. It's of a very nice size and shape because it goes into saliva very readily. And that really is great for stress researchers like myself, because you might imagine if I had to run around after children with a large syringe saying, I want to know if you're stressed out or not. Kind of end up like this, I suppose. But, I mean, anyone that spends a long time with children, you come to understand that they do have trying times. And a large part of that involves their social environment. And what's going on here in response to these stressors is a complex physiological cascade, the end product of which is cortisol. And it has a negative feedback system such that as cortisol gets elevated, and then once it's been dumped into the plasma and circulates around, it goes back and shuts off the pump. So it has a nice thermostat system. Now, it's been argued that if you're exposed to early trauma, that can damage the system. It is toxic to the dendrites and the receptors that are responsible for turning off the cortisol. And so a child that's been exposed to early trauma now has a damaged thermostat. And as a consequence, they're going to be more likely to have more difficulty in controlling the levels of their cortisol. And that's a hypothesis that I'm going to be testing, albeit somewhat crudely. The general paradigm in stress research was that you get exposed to early trauma. This results in damage to these glucocorticoid receptors in the hippocampus. This then results in dysregulation of the cortisol system, the HPA system. And because cortisol is also, it does a lot of different things. But partly what it's doing is modulating immune function and trafficking, directing immune function. And so if your cortisol system isn't working right, you're likely to have some immune problems as well. And this in turn is going to result in higher morbidity for children. They're going to be more susceptible to infectious disease and other health problems. So that's the sort of the basic model that's been out there in the literature for a long time. And some of the tests of this involve looking at organisms that have had traumatic early experiences, whether they be white rats or mice or rhesus macaques or humans, and then looking at how they, as adults, respond to a stressor. And the general finding is that there are elevated levels of cortisol beyond which we would expect for someone who had not been exposed to early trauma. The data on humans are rather complex, and you get some studies which indicate hypercortisolemia, some which indicate hypocortisolemia. It's a complex literature, and I'd love to talk about it in detail, but we'll just leave it at its... most everyone thinks that it's problematic. It's not being regulated properly. An alternative hypothesis to the idea that psychological stress or social challenges that cause the release of cortisol is some pathology, just a mistake. I mean, I guess I'm a real dyed-in-the-wool adaptationist, but when you read that hypothesis that humans, our response to our social world and releasing cortisol is just a mistake that shouldn't happen, alarm bells go off, because it just looks like an adaptation. I mean, it's complex. And Gerald Huther has suggested an alternative, which is that you need this stress response in order to modify neural connections that are important for understanding your social world. And we understand some of the details about what the effects are of cortisol on neurons in the brain, and clearly a lot of it is catabolic, breaking down connections and then allowing for rebuilding to improve your model of the social world, if you will. So that's a plausible alternative hypothesis that fits a little better, I think, with an adaptationist perspective. But nobody's been able to test this stuff, because really what you need are long-term prospective studies. You need to be able to follow a child through, ideally from even before conception, through pregnancy, infancy, childhood, and into adulthood. And psychologists and psychiatrists very rarely would have the opportunity for that kind of research. That's the beauty of being an anthropologist. If you're persistent and dogged enough, you can find yourself having lived in the same village for 20 years, which I have. And you guys have seen this before this morning. Basically, I've been collecting a lot of data and a lot of spit in this population. And basic routine is very early in the morning we get up and we follow a route to the different neighborhoods or hamlets in the village. And as we visit each household and as we encounter the child, we record what they're doing, be it sweeping up in the yard, taking care of a little brother, working in the field. And as we're doing this, we're collecting saliva, recording all the relevant information to go along, to be tagged with those samples. We also put a huge investment into talking to the kids, getting to know them very intimately, being able to ask questions about how they feel that day and why, how things went with Granny and so forth. So, if you have a good photographic memory, you'll notice that this is the same doorstep. Actually, I interviewed these two girls, their mother on this very doorstep some 10 years, 12, no, much earlier than that. Yeah, about 10 or 12 years before this shot. Day after day after day after day, talking to the kids, getting to know them real well. So, what kinds of stuff results in elevated cortisol levels? And here we're looking at real substantial elevations, more than 2 standard deviations above normal. It's social family stuff. That's the biggie. If we look at the stability of these profiles year to year, I'm just going to show you 3 case examples, and I chose them because they're beautiful for illustrating different patterns. I could show you some ugly ones, but these are nice. Here's a child with a very consistent, stable cortisol profile. And about 44% of the kids in the village have that kind of stability. A slightly larger proportion have got some years in which they've gone up or down significantly, usually we're looking at going up. And almost all the time there's something tagged with these yearly changes. Something happened, Dad went away, or Mom went away to go work in a different village, or something along those lines that we can find to be associated with these changes in patterns of cortisol. And then once in a while we'll get these permanent changes, what appear to be long-term permanent changes in cortisol profiles, and these are relatively rare. And they would seem to fit the hypothesis that something has happened here, a significant traumatic event has happened to this child, which has now changed the way that they regulate their cortisol. But in every one of these cases, there's a continuing source of stress. So I can't really tease the hypotheses apart in terms of their environments are continuing to be stressful for them. It's not that something has changed in terms of their regulatory feedback thermostat, if you will. And looking at this in a more statistically appropriate fashion, when you get these major changes, it's a circumstance under which you do have a persistent stressful environment. Okay, I'm probably going to fly through this a bit. Here's a sample family. Jessica, you might recognize the two girls again. Genealogies. Another beautiful thing we have here are these genealogies going back 6, 7, 8 generations. And that gives us a lot of power to look at some things. My former student colleague, Rob Quinlan, is particularly gifted at investigating that type of information. A lot of different types of step-parent families, and here I'm just sort of trying to categorize them into several types. What we would call a visiting male household. And here, mom is in control. She's got power. She typically is surrounded by her parents or other close relatives. Another type is co-resident stepfather, where the mother has children by a previous male or males, but she doesn't have any children yet by the stepfather. And then there are households in which there's a co-resident stepfather where this new male has his own kids with a woman, but she's had children by a previous male. It's very common for these kids by a previous male to leave and go live with their grandparents or with other close relatives. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. It really depends. And kids there, they forage social attention. So they're really good at spending the night in this relative's house or that relative's house. They've got this insurance policy, and boy, it's a great thing. I may not get around to all my practical suggestions here, but that's a big difference between a community, a kin-based community like this, and modern industrial society in which we have families blocked off, and so that folks are very distant from the relatives. And then finally, we have some circumstances in which the father visits the stepmom, and we don't have any co-resident stepmothers. Looking at what the consequences are for stepkids, how stress affects them. Here, looking at that type of household in which we have the male's genetic children and stepchildren, the cortisol levels are significantly higher for the stepkids. And this is primarily a consequence of stress that they're dealing with in the house. If we look at them outside the house, at school, other circumstances, they often have lower cortisol levels than their half-siblings. If we look at morbidity levels, stepkids are sick more often than their half-siblings. Looking at the developmental issues, ontogeny, and whether or not early trauma predisposes kids to having problems with their cortisol and immune function. I don't think I'm going to show you any immune data, but I'd be happy to talk about it later. What kinds of things here are we looking at in terms of early trauma? Hurricanes, political revolutions, doesn't affect them. Don't see any changes. But if you've got deaths in the family, divorces, abuse of various sorts, then you do see effects. And it really doesn't show any sort of critical periods in terms of cortisol response. But these red bars here, basically, if you've been exposed to early trauma, you have higher cortisol on average than controls that have not. If we look at one measure of immune function, secretory IgA, there's a difference there with the traumatic kids having lower levels, particularly when they need it. Morbidity, a similar pattern with the kids that have been exposed to early trauma, showing higher levels of morbidity. One explanation here is that initial hypothesis I showed you that, gosh, you have early trauma, you damage those glucocorticoid receptors, and now our cortisol system's out of whack, and we've got all kinds of health problems. If that were true, then we would expect that kids that are elevating cortisol in response to physical stressors, like walking up the mountain with your goat, or, we can look at sports too, but there's a big social component to that, but just strict physical stressors in which cortisol is released, because it's really important for releasing energy in your system. Something like this. This is a 12-year-old boy who's carrying about 60 pounds of wood on his head at this 10 o'clock time period. And it's very reliable. You'll see a bump up in cortisol in response to that kind of physical activity. If we look at the recovery after that sort of physical stressor, for the kids that had been exposed to early trauma, if their thermostats had been mucked up by the exposure to early trauma, we would expect to see that they're not very good at damping down their cortisol levels after exposure to the physical stressor. The data don't support that hypothesis. There doesn't seem to be a problem with their cortisol regulation in response to physical stressors. They do perfectly fine. So whatever has changed that's resulting in their having higher cortisol levels on average, it's not, near as we can tell, issues with their thermostat. It appears to be stressor specific. Social stressors are what they're really sensitized to and what we see higher levels of cortisol in response to. It's a little dicey. Some of these kids clearly are in environments in which they're getting more social stress. There's a relationship between having been exposed to early trauma and then having continuing stressful environments, and that's partly what we're picking up here. Okay, some of the ameliorative factors that we found. Looking at alloparental care, and we have a number of ways of measuring this. But kids that have high levels of alloparental care seem to do just fine. On the other hand, kids that have been exposed to early trauma and they don't have this extensive kin network to rely on, they're the kids that we're seeing these continued high levels of cortisol with. So grandmothers and aunties are really important, particularly for kids that are in high-risk situations. So, sort of coming to a conclusion here, a big model. How do I think it works? If we take that existing model of early trauma leading to health problems with stress regulation as sort of mediator, I think it works a little bit differently. I think part of what's going on here is that these kids are having trouble with developing social skills, which in turn results in more issues with regulation of cortisol. And that in turn then is having these downstream effects on their health. And I don't want to sort of steal my own thunder here, but I'm playing up cortisol as being a really big deal here, and I just want to be a little more cautious because it's pretty clear that this is one factor that is involved in this flow, but you can do really well without it. And if I have run through some conclusions here, and then I'll come back to that issue. But summarizing the data that we have so far, it seems pretty clear that step kids with early traumatic experiences have higher cortisol levels, diminished immunity, and higher morbidity, but that these effects are not apparently a result of some disrupted thermostat system, but rather that something else is going on here. And the result that the recovery from physical stressors wasn't affected by early traumatic experiences, I think that's pretty convincing that we don't have a problem with the thermostat. Something else is going on here. A lot more importance for the brain and what's going on with that. Care is really important. We see it in the cortisol response, but we see it in a lot of other areas as well in terms of how these kids do. And this hypothesized model, the links between early trauma and poor health, it's just not as simple and straightforward as I think has been portrayed in the psychological literature so far. When you look at this in the context of a community that has these extensive kin ties, it's pretty clear those are very important. And a lot of what's going on here in terms of the kids' downstream outcomes involve whether or not they're able themselves to develop the social competencies to get support. And if they do, they tend to do pretty well. And if they don't, then they seem to have continued problems. The data that we want are pretty similar to the data that I said we wanted earlier. They're a little different. We're really excited about continuing this longitudinally because, if we get 30, 40 years, that could be pretty exciting in terms of being able to look at longitudinal effects and when you're a grandchild and all those kinds of things in terms of multi-generational effects of this. The genetics of this, I think, will be very important. We'd also like to get some more specific kinds of information about the pathogens that are important for people in this community and what kinds of risks are more affected by social challenges that they can then worry about. And then also it will be fun to look at the differences between our species and those of our close relatives. And again, I have so many people to thank, including you all.
Can we just take one question, please?
I don't need it. I've got this.
That there are potential benefits to the higher cortisol levels for some of those children?
Sure. In the sense that, elevating your cortisol is serving a function. And, is it advantageous to continue to have the high cortisol? Well, if you're trying to meet a demand. And at some point it gets kind of pathological because you get burned out. So chronic stress can get to a point. But I think you're making the best of a bad situation, and that's what's involved with that. It's an excellent question, and the sort of thing that hopefully we'll figure out in more detail the longer we're there and the more we can track long-term outcomes.
Do you need to say that? Yeah, just need that corner. Well, actually,
You need a different one, don't you?
We can maybe take another question, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I'll multitask here.
This is related to the previous question, that it always seems odd that the hippocampal receptors should be so vulnerable to stress-induced damage. That since cortisol is, your own body produces it. It's not like some toxin that comes in from the environment. It mainly has a signaling function. So it's been there for a long time. Why is there does it have some metabolic property that makes it inherently toxic without which it couldn't do its job elsewhere in the body? Why should there be this bizarre trade-off where you can see why the body would want to mobilize itself for increased vigilance or turning up the thermostat to deal with a stressor, but why should it allow itself to be damaged so easily, given that it's hard to imagine other organs in the body that could be so easily damaged by a kind of experience that all of us have at some point in our lifetime?
It's not clear to me that there is this damage.
Yeah. That would be one answer.
Polyphenism, it's an adaptive phenotypic response. certainly there are levels at which it could become pathological.
One would then surmise that those kinds of circumstances had been very rare in our evolutionary history, and so we hadn't evolved to be resistant to that.
Okay. Daly and Wilson's proposal that old folk tales about vicious, cruel step-parents are rooted in real-life epidemiological risk factors is by now the oldest, first proposed in 1980, and most robustly documented finding in all of human sociobiology. So why the fuss for so long? I mean, we could all understand why Martin is exercised, but why this fuss? Definitely, Blake Sladeism is part of the story. People don't like these evolutionary explanations, but I don't think that's quite the whole story. I think a number of critics have erroneously conflated what Daly and Wilson are saying, their interpretation of child abuse by unrelated males in human primates, with evidence for adaptive infanticide by unrelated males in other primates, even though the patterning of infanticidal behavior in other primates is very different in a number of respects. However, this error is almost as common among the proponents of their perspectives as it is among those opposed to selfish gene or evolutionary perspectives, further promoting misunderstandings and fueling the controversy here. Just quickly, non-human primates, infanticide is widely documented now, typically involves an unrelated male. In this picture, a male is coming in from the outside of the breeding system. There's an infant just going off in the air like a rag out of its mouth. The two females charging him, and this is very relevant to a question somebody asked earlier, are not the mother. These are related, all right, but they're not the mother. The one in front is a post-reproductive female, very likely the grandmother or great aunt of the infant involved, and the other female is also an old female. The young mother is on the sidelines. I think part of the answer, Martin alluded to it, why we don't have this in humans. In humans, mothers' allies do a better job, a much better job, and there are a lot more social sanctions against abusing kids. People don't forget it, they don't like it. Females are also doing this, but the important thing to remember is that the killer is never a relative of the mother, virtually never the father, not an adoptive parent, not any other animal in a protective or caretaking role, not an alloparent, not a stepmother. It is a rival of the mother if it's a female case. Whereas monkey and ape mothers are just extraordinarily patient and dedicated and care for their infants no matter what, the level of discriminative maternal solicitude in non-human primates is, you just can't even detect it. These mothers will care for an infant regardless of sex. Sarah Turner has data for, unfortunately, a population of free-ranging macaques in Japan where a lot of the babies are born without limbs. Mothers care for them. Mothers care no matter what, the exception being very young and inexperienced mothers who are kind of clueless and can be very incompetent, and they lose a whole lot of their babies. So learning is important, but if something happens to an infant, a mother will carry it around for days, the desiccated corpse. And presumably, Martin kind of alluded to this, this is on the off chance that the baby's just comatose and is going to come back to life. Okay, humans are a very different story. As Mark has told us, as Martin and Margo have told us, no other primate is born so big, requires so much care from so many for so long before becoming nutritionally independent, which is probably why, compared to most other primates, human mothers are unusually sensitive to how much social support they have, this alloparental care that Mark Flinn has been telling us about. Children are sensitive to it, and so are mothers. Ed Hagen is here. I know he's proposed that part of postpartum depression is related to this mother's sensibility to social support. These mothers are also unusually discriminating about which infants they're going to care for, and they're a lot more ambivalent about caretaking. The only other primates that come close to humans in terms of their rates of abandonment or abuse comparable to those found in humans are among cooperatively breeding non-human primates. Like, there are about 35 species of callitrichids. These are tamarins and marmosets. And as you can see in the top corner, mother usually gives birth to twins. The dad or another female that she has mated with, could be several males, carry the babies all the time. Other group members, older siblings, possibly incomers from outside the group, catch food. About the time the baby is weaned, they're provisioning that infant. It's the highest rates of abandonment that have ever been reported in primates that are not human come from these guys. If a mother is in a situation without social support, the rates of abandonment go up to about 57% of infants born. You have to look hard to find humans with rates that high, but you can. Among the IPO of New Guinea, this is a group studied by the German medical doctor and anthropologist Wolf Schiefenhofer. A woman announced that if she had another daughter, she wasn't going to keep it. Sure enough, the daughter was born, and she decided not to keep it. In the end, though, it's a very interesting story. I talk about it in Mother Nature, but it's one of these cases where the mother's going to abandon her baby and changes her mind. So she ends up keeping this baby. But the rates of abandonment among the IPO are about 41%, very high, but comparable to another cooperatively breeding primate. Okay, so people object to Martin and Margo, but of course, maternal infanticide right after birth, the neonaticide Martin was talking about, is in humans probably the most common form of homicide, if you want to count it as homicide. And wherever mothers do not have access to safe birth control or to other means of family planning, and wherever they find themselves short on social support, mothers abandon their infants within days, within about the same range of 72 hours right after birth, same as callitrichids. Interestingly, it's just a nice little tidbit for you. Margo mentions that this is kind of considered unpalatable, this business of step-parents doing things. In the original versions of both Hansel and Gretel and Snow White, the killer was the mother, not the stepmother, and it was in later editions of the Grimm's Brothers' Nursery and Household Tales that they substituted a step-parent because they thought that would be more politically acceptable, and I don't think it had anything to do with neoconservatism. Okay. So some critics of the Cinderella effect, and Cinderella, as far as my knowledge of folklore goes, I used to be a folklore person. As far as my knowledge of folklore goes, she really was a stepdaughter. Probably that reflexive hostility to evolutionary explanations is there, but I think some of the other critics just weren't paying attention to what Daly and Wilson actually wrote, and they attributed to them an adaptationist perspective, which they definitely have, but they weren't arguing in this context because they didn't do their homework. And so the take-home message is we, all of us, evolutionists and our critics and journalists alike, need to be a lot more careful about what we say and a lot more vigilant about our preconceptions, obviously. Secondly, it's always worth keeping in mind the cost-benefit components to Hamilton's rule. And you guys talked about that a little bit today. But I just want to go on and stress, partly as a segue into Mark's talk and also into the kinds of interventions I want to talk about later, that if we look at this from an infant's point of view, certainly, but even from the parent's point of view, degree of relatedness is not necessarily the whole story. And I'm going to tell you a little illustration of how these things can get conflated and cause trouble. Last month, Franz de Waal and I and a couple of other primatologists got an email from the one of the editors at Nova who was putting on an online story about killer instincts. And they wanted to do something on infanticide, and he sent me this thing, and I was a little bit alarmed at what I read. And so I wrote him back right away. I was in the Netherlands, but I wrote him back right away, and I said, a very common misperception, which leads people to equate what goes on with mother's boyfriend and what goes on with new males entering the breeding system from outside it among non-human primates. Please, please, please don't go there. Okay, it just went up, the website. It reads, why is infanticide so widespread among primates, including the great apes, and what does that say about us? And he goes on to say, quote, all this leads me, the Nova editor, to wonder just how different am I fundamentally from an infanticidal non-human primate. When I first met the woman who would later bear my 2 children, I never felt an urge to kill her 4-year-old son from a previous marriage. But is a tendency towards infanticide, even if suppressed, buried somewhere in my genes, and there it is. And so I don't think this is going to go away anytime soon, Martin. You just better relax. Okay, now on to Mark's beautiful integration, just what we need, naturalistic circumstances, combination of ethology, evolutionary perspective, and physiology. It almost doesn't get better than that. And so he shows today this wonderful slide. Stepchildren exposed to early family trauma who have alloparental attention, and he has that same slide, same pattern if it's just a grandmother. I mean, it's just wonderful. Alloparental care can ameliorate these effects. I've just been in Leiden visiting Marinus von Eisendorn at the Center for Child and Family Studies there, and they've just done a very comparable kind of study of what happens to adopted children. They had data from orphanages, one in Romania, one in Greece. These are very bad places for kids to end up, and not surprisingly, if they stay there, they suffer all the kinds of things Mark was talking about, including failure to thrive. They just don't grow very well. And so this slide, which is going to be kind of hard to interpret, the baseline there is a child that was in one of those orphanages that was lucky enough to be adopted by a welcoming family. We don't know too much about any discriminations in there, Martin. We just know that it was a welcoming family. And the catch-up growth is very impressive. So if compared to their past peers, that is the poor children still in the orphanage, they've really grown a lot. Compared to their current peers, that is children who were never exposed to the trauma of being in this orphanage, they're not doing quite as well, but they're catching up. And these effects were similar in security of attachment and also in cognitive effects. And this is really a way of reminding us that if we're looking at this from the point of view that I know some of you in here who are really on the front lines of working with children, you're looking at it from the children's point of view. And from a child's perspective, the R component that matters is not so much the degree of relatedness, it's the responsiveness and the nurturing tendencies of the caretaker. So that's what I'm going to turn to now. Somebody, I think it was you, John Horgan, asked about adoption. Van Eisendorn has also done a really interesting study recently, taking data from, what is this telling me? From 17 of the Dutch Child Protective Services who gets abused. And These data are not yet, they're submitted, but they haven't been approved. But when I asked him if I could show this slide today, and I told him that Martin and Margo were going to be here, he said, "Oh, yes, in that company, please." So he wants you to see this. And as expected from their work, if you look in terms of the national representation, 6% of children are living with step-parents, and they are accounting for 10% of children who are abused. And this is a country where it's like Sweden. There's not going to be a whole lot of child abuse. The adopted families is what's so interesting. 1% of the sample, but just a tiny fraction of those abused. These are educated, willing parents. My guess is a lot of them don't have children of their own, and they are open. And that is the good news in this whole story, which is the order primates. Joan Silk was talking about this earlier. We are very attracted to babies. And it is also true, and this is from Joan's earlier work, that most adoption in traditional societies is by kin. But that doesn't stop it from working very, very well among non-relatives, and it does. There are going to be circumstances then when an alloparent, even an unrelated alloparent, is going to be more willing to invest than a genetic parent. There is this reservoir of potential out there, and that's what we need to focus on in these interventions. Okay, let me just briefly review some of the ethologically informed interventions that I know of. These are not hypothetical, like how do we stop war? These are things that people are doing now, and that ethology is beginning to seep in and to inform welfare services, and especially child development people are very receptive to this stuff. Absolutely key. Mark has talked about it. Social support for mothers. We already know that if this is the work of David Olds in Canada, remarkably long-term, remarkably successful. His results are so impressive that they've become controversial. I mean, their data are as good as yours, so people don't believe them. But these tiny little interventions can have very long-term effects. He had these trained women, very supportive, kid-like women. They're as if alloparents coming in and spending some time with a mother right after birth. These are mothers whose kids otherwise might be at risk. Increased breastfeeding, much less abuse. Results later on actually show up in school-age behavior and performance. Remarkable results. A colleague that I haven't met yet, but he's been corresponding with me since Mother Nature was published, because he's actually using some stuff in Mother Nature to help him design an intervention center. He calls it Maternal Havens in Alaska. He works with Inuit people. And he recently did a study as a way, I think, of generating support for the project. I'll tell you about it in a second. And he has shown that across nations, generous parental leaves are correlated with reduced child abuse. Well, it's going to make sense. I mean, it means that mothers, also fathers, have more time to actually convince themselves that they're related to this baby. Early prolonged exposure to infant cues is linked, we heard this from John Archer earlier today, linked to lower testosterone, prolactin going up. People call this a paternal response. Maybe it is, but it also could just be an alloparental response. We don't know whether we're calling it a paternal effect, but it could just be an effect of males. Alison Fleming has shown the importance of experience. Men with a lot of experience taking care of babies are much more susceptible to these cues, much more nurturing. I have to put in this plug. The testosterone effect in males, by the way, we have known since the 1980s that marmoset dads, when they're holding babies, their prolactin levels go up. Why didn't anybody look in humans? Why not? Well, I think I know why not. I think it had to do with our preconceptions about who mothers babies. And we weren't looking enough at traditional societies where fathers are actually often doing a lot of hands-on care. But it was two women in Canada. Let's hear it for the Canadians and the women. It was Anne Story and Catherine Wynne Edwards who first said, let's look at this. And the results were astounding. And now lots of people are looking at it, and it's all to the good. Breastfeeding. All the things I've talked about, support to mothers, parental leave, all those things, this increases the chances mothers are going to breastfeed. Breastfeeding transforms mothers. I would love to have data on whether or not these mothers who are willing to leave babies with a possibly abusive boyfriend are breastfeeding. Because my guess is they're not. And it's nice because it's a counterintuitive hypothesis, because only if they were breastfeeding would it actually even make a difference in terms of the male's reproductive access. I mean, he's already got the key to her house, and he's already sleeping with her. So whether or not if she was breastfeeding, it would make a difference. But I suspect it's going to be the other way around, that if a mother's breastfeeding, she's going to be much more vigilant of who's holding her baby and look for more support. I also think it's less likely she's going to have a boyfriend in the house if she's breastfeeding. That's another story. Alison Fleming's work on the importance of experience. We've already talked about von Eisendorn and adoption. And then there's Mary Dozier's study, a woman at the University of Delaware. The importance of a mother's own experience. Mary Dozier was looking at children who were going to be placed with foster mothers, but before they were placed, she did these in-depth adult attachment interviews with the mothers and determined what was their own experience like. Did they think mother-infant relationships were important, or are they kind of dismissive of that stuff? And sure enough, the success rates in terms of infant security and security of attachment are way up for these, I call them the super nurturing mothers. I mean, these women that we need to clone and promote, and because we are probably, as a culture, losing a lot of this nurturing. We don't do it anymore, and the kids who haven't had it are not going to pass it on. So anyway, I think with that, we should probably have our break and then open it up for discussion.